Anthony Lawlor has been an award-winning architect for over 30 years. It has been his passion to discover and he is the author of 24 Patterns of Wisdom, a home with Sherry Lawlor, entitled Two is One. He has some fascinating things to share with us this morning. We are fortunate to have him. Please welcome Anthony Lawlor.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful we're all conscious in our bodies and everything's in balance. So we all had a little scare there for a moment. And now we're back here in this room together. And what can scare us, I think, a lot is loss of consciousness and loss of being aware of our surroundings and that disconnection. And one of the things I focused on in my architectural career is that connection between consciousness and physical form in the physical world. And the essence of all of that is that every design form, from the chair you're sitting on to the road out there to the whole city, all started as an impulse in consciousness. Every object in this room at one time didn't exist before the idea for the projector screen, the books, the bookcases, the floor, the wall, the ceiling. Somebody had an idea that I'll make a place to sit. I'll make a table to sit on. And that idea, they gathered the information, the materials around to make that table or chair or floor. So we're literally living within our imaginations, not in some mystical way. Everything here came out of our imagination. In a way, it's like a substance in that. If one day, where I used to live, and they came and there was a house there, and then they tore the house down, and the house was gone. And watching them tear this house down was like watching them withdraw the idea of a house from all those materials. It's like a thread, they pulled that out. And so how this has developed recently in my work and my writing is, instead of there's consciousness in architecture, what's the architecture of consciousness? And the architecture of consciousness is patterns. The mind that you're listening with is a pattern-making machine. We always want to look for the weather patterns. We want to see patterns in the stock market. We want to see patterns on the football field, patterns in how our children grow, patterns in how we get from one place to the other. So then I thought, okay, there's all this talk of personal growth, personal evolution, enlightenment. What are the patterns of that? How can I set up a visual description of that? So I developed these 24 patterns that describe this journey. And so what I'd like to do is go through these patterns quickly, and then we talk about them. We've all heard that phrase when somebody is going to die, that their life passes before their eyes. And to my knowledge, no one before this has outlined what is the patterns of unfoldment of consciousness before. So let's just go through these and we'll talk about them, and then we can open it up for discussion, because I'd like this to be a discussion. So we're born into the world and we find ourselves surrounded by patterns. This is, oh, good, we can start again. the mystery. We have to start from the beginning for this. So we're born into the world. We have our experience. We find ourselves surrounded by patterns. Patterns in nature, human-made patterns, patterns in the mind, patterns in the body, patterns in the environment. Now, where does it begin and where does it go? There's an old Zen question. What was your face before you were born? And then when we try to think of that, it stops the mind. We come up with nothing. So that's where I started. Just with this idea, we start with consciousness that's undefined. Then there's that moment when consciousness turns on itself, we become aware of itself. We go, I am here, I exist. And we watch babies, they become aware of their fingers and their toes, and it's fascinating. And in that discovery. And from that seed of self-awareness, we naturally develop a circle of perception, where we're standing at the center of that circle, we perceive the environment around us, and there's those rays of perception between us and the environment. So right now, you're sitting at the center of your perception. And as many people as are in here are circles of perception. And each of us is looking around at the room, and there's that circle of objects in the world, and then there's that experience that links us to that. And that unified whole circle of perception, we start to see self and other. So every interaction, when we interact with another person, there's our circle of perception and their circle of perception. And those places of overlap are the place of our relationships, unity, diversity, conflict, harmony. But what happens in that experience is the sense of our wholeness often gets fragmented. The oneness that we are tends to go, well, what's that person thinking of me? I said the wrong thing. Things start to fragment, and it opens up a certain basis of a kind of wounding, where we're walking around the world with this sense of lack of wholeness, where we don't feel whole because our awareness is getting caught in the objects of perception. And we find ourselves living within this kind of fragmentation of the world, where we feel a sense of woundedness, but where there's nowhere to go. And to avoid that woundedness, we generate what I've called here a belief grid, a grid of ideas that maps out the world for us. What our values are, what we believe is closer to the truth, farther apart from the truth. We map the world. So when we're seeing on television political pundits or politicians arguing, it's usually one belief grid interacting with another belief grid. And they don't want to give in, and it's just a clash of belief grids. But life has its way of blurring the edges of our belief grid. So everyone's experienced times in life where we think we know the truth, we know how things are, and something happens, and our belief system is upended. It shakes that. And it usually happens that at some point in our lives, our rigid belief grid becomes this fluid ocean of experience. That's what's happening in the world now. The old world of analog cause and effect is giving way to the digital world, where everything's becoming this fluid state of interaction. And old categories are dissolving. And so we feel out at sea. So the natural response to that, the mind creates some lifeboat in the midst of this ocean, some place to grab onto, where we can stand. We are used to standing in our rigid belief grid. We think we're standing on solid ground. Then the watery fluid grid happens and we're out at sea, and we want to stand on solid ground again. So we derive some kind of lifeboat to grab onto. And once we do that, we feeling a little safe, our natural tendency is to want to spread that in the sense of control. We try to spread our thing out into the environment and try to suppress those activities and movements of life, or at least bring them under our control. We've further increased this by dividing the world into this checkerboard of friends and enemies, safety and danger, what's good, what's bad. And in this attempt to try to bring harmony to our situation, we actually upend it because we put ourselves in conflict with life. Because we're going around and everything is either is our friend or our foe, what's right, what's wrong, and it starts to cause confusion. The tendency after that is usually to reinforce that, our defenses, and build up this defensive wall against the activities of life. But the wider fluid web of life overpowers us. There's some flood experience. We have a divorce, a disease, financial loss, some kind of thing that happens, a tsunami happens, an earthquake happens, that overwhelms our defensive walls. But that's not the end of the situation or a negative thing. Usually we come out of that and we're more fluid. We still have our individual structure intact, but it's more responsive. Have people experienced that? They've gone through life, they had things where they knew everything. Usually when we're young, the younger we are, the more we know solidly. And then life comes along, we go through some overwhelming experience, divorce, financial loss, and we come through it, and we're stronger, but we're more flexible and more fluid and more able to do that. And what can happen then is that our life then can become a dialogue with existence rather than a fighting with it and an opposition, us and them. It becomes this fluid dialogue of life. Then things get interesting. Our self-centered way of looking at things starts to become more of a field, off to the edge way of looking at things. And as our viewpoint expands, our arcs of a perception expand. So this is an interesting slide because we've all seen this Fibonacci spiral. But the spiral is generated as you change the point where the compass is. I liken that to changing our viewpoint. We're standing at this center. So as our viewpoint changes, that spiral of experience starts to unfold. And as our arcs of experience unfold in growth, we encounter arcs of decay. So we find that life is this dynamic experience between creation and dissolution and renewal. And we can see that without dissolution there can be no renewal. And life then tends to take our straight path and curve it and twist it into a labyrinth where we feel like we're moving through the twists and turns of experience, that where our expectations are then constantly upended, so that then what opens up in that twisting, turning experience, at the center of that experience, we arrive at this point of wordless wisdom, where there's this source of consciousness that's beyond words. How many people have had that experience? And it's some moment, you're at the Grand Canyon, you just can't put it into words. There's some moment in a movie, in a song, where the words just cannot contain the depth and beauty of that experience. And that wordless wisdom opens up the seeds of experience that then can sprout into new patterns. And unfold in the flowering of experience. And we've had those moments where everything is full, it all seems clear, it's radiant and beautiful, and our life seems very full. That's not the end of the story. Life then, well, we're kind of in between patterns, but life then dissolves those patterns. Have you seen those Tibetan sand mandalas that are made, where they spend days, grain by grain, intricately making these elaborate, beautiful designs? And so once they're finished, they don't put them in plastic or something and put them up on the wall. They don't enshrine them and cover them with glass. What they do is they take a cloth and they sweep it up. And they put it in a vase, they walk down to the river, and they pour it into the water. And it's in that release of experience that the real freedom and grace of living happens. And so life then opens us up to wave after wave of ever deeper, deeper experience. So that patterns, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when the slides are over. Every pattern we see is not an end in itself. It's a gateway for the consciousness that's forming that pattern. It's an opening beyond form into the formless experience. And so that our life and the life of the world are really vessels for the flow of consciousness. No object, person, place is an end in itself. It has its life and its vitality by the energy and intelligence flowing through it. So every pattern, physical pattern that we see, is this vessel for the flow of creativity, energy, and love. So I took the name of your group and I said, okay, what's the inside edge? And the edge is that moment where your spirit meets patterns and sparks effective and innovative ways of living. And it's all in the book there. So those are my 24 patterns. Thank you. So we rushed through the total conscious experience of life. And did it stir up any questions that you might have? Or responses? Yes?
Thank you very much. It was an interesting presentation. When I think about patterns, I think about everything is sort of out there, and then we create from what we have inside of us. Each person creates their own pattern. And I wondered if you could speak about that.
You can also look at it in a different way, that we have our internal patterns that we then find outside of ourselves. So one pattern that we have every day, hundreds of times a day, is the pattern of desiring something, searching for it, and finding it. So it's a pattern. We're hungry, we're searching in the refrigerator, we find our very healthy food, and we eat it. Now this pattern is enacted in architecture, in every piece of architecture that you walk into, whether it's the supermarket or a cathedral. There's a gateway, there's a path, and there's a place of arrival. And so we've shaped the world in those patterns. Also, those patterns are recognizable to us because we have them inside of us. So we see the pattern of a nautilus shell. We seek that pattern. And as we saw, it resonates with us because internally we know that experience of moving from a point to a point, and our sweep of awareness moving, and then it moving and getting wider and wider. So there's that inner resonance between inner and outer patterns. Another way of looking at this is that there isn't a difference between inner and outer, that it's all consciousness. That we experience somewhat as inner and somewhat as outer. So even on the physical level, if I try to say what's inner and what's outer, it's hard for me to take a break, the breaking point. Say, this is our pattern, and I'm now going to make the world fit into my pattern. Because then the world says, no, no, no.
So I can't go to Las Vegas with my pattern.
You do, but how you go to Las Vegas with your pattern is, some people would say, I have a preconceived idea. And the extreme would be every minute is scheduled, and I know what experience I'm going to have ahead of time and all that. That's the extreme of preconceived pattern. Mm-hmm. The other way is I'm going to go to Las Vegas, and I know I like to play blackjack, or I know I like these shows. And to say, okay, that's my window into life through Las Vegas. And so while I'm in Las Vegas, say in the casino or something, I say, okay, this is my framework for discovering life. Not a preconceived thing of I know what life is, but we use our pattern to discover what's beyond the pattern. That's the vision. And that's what life is pushing us toward. You know, whatever our pattern is and whatever our plans are, no matter how much effort we put into it, how hard we try, how insincere we are, that's just the vessel for setting out on the journey. If we don't open up to what arises, then why go on the journey? Because we're cutting ourselves off from that dialogue with life.
So it can't be manipulated, in other words.
No, you can try to manipulate it.
Okay, just curious.
No,
Patterns
you can
are
try to
patterns,
manipulate
you know?
it. And that's the tendency, but life keeps pushing back. So rather than beating our head against that wall, my experience is, why not just go, okay, I'm in my little boat on the ocean of life. Hey, where is it going from here? So and this is after a long time of many asking these kind of experiences, the ultimate knowledge for my life personally is open and take the next step. That's the most planning that I need. And that seems to be working out, the more I do that. Any other? Yeah. Oh, you had a question, Matt. Oh. We'll go quickly.
Okay. In looking at your patterns, I'm a psychotherapist and psychoanalyst, so I think I work right at that edge of the belief grid and where life experience comes in. And there's a tipping point where the belief grid will expand and change or become more entrenched. Right?
Right. And yes, and life keeps wanting it to expand. We want to entrench it. But what you bring up is that edge, and this relates to your group. The very interesting place is where that known pattern meets the unknown. Because that's where possibilities are. You know, people talk about innovation, creativity, and all that. That doesn't mean just creating what we already know. That's not creativity. It's going into the unknown. But to say, I'm just going to go into the unknown without any structure, that's where a person can have a breakdown. They don't have breakthroughs, they have breakdowns. But the breakthrough is where the edge of the known meets that unknowable, really. And we keep doing that in our life if we live a creative life, not just as artists, but as business people, healers, whatever we do, when that known edge keeps encountering the known, the unknown, and the unknowable. And we have this tendency, we want to pin it down, we want to know, but the really juicy part of life is the unknowable. Yes. And that's also the source of continual renewal and new life all the time. It's not in the already existed form. You have your question.
Well, every time somebody says something, I have another question. It's just very exciting. But let me see if I can articulate this. One, it feels to me like you're talking about this journey that we are all on, and by implication, the world is on. And it sounds to me like you're saying that this is a positive evolution. And then the second question is, and I want you to answer that, the second question is, how does one encourage that place of the wordless wisdom in self and in others? How is there something? I mean, you mentioned, well, you go through a divorce or you lose your money or something. So there's the trauma that can move you to that place. Is there any other way that we can move ourselves into that place without manipulating?
Without the pain?
What? Without
Everyone's relating to your question. The tendency, say we go through a divorce. Some people, immediately they want to go, how can I find another person? How can I get remarried? How can I rebuild my life? They want to restructure the pattern. And the best way of dealing with that is to sense that silence, to actually honor and acknowledge the gap that has opened up. Because there's a gap. What happened is there's an expectation, and the result was very different than the expectation. So there's this gap. Now, most of the time, we're rushing to fill that gap. But that gap is where the juicy access to life is. And we're running out of time. We're at the end of our time. And so I'm trying to think of how to wrap this up in a good way. But it's to honor that gap. And even though we're there's part of us that wants to pull in and say, okay, and we might do that. We might start trying to get another relationship and all that. But it's to be aware and to honor that silence. So as you go through your day and you are encountering your patterns, whether you're in the supermarket, driving in the car, noticing all these patterns of life. Also notice that silent awareness that's there, that gap, and honor that and see what it has to tell you. Thank you. Thank you.